Welcome to African Folktales by Tammy. Please don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more interesting stories. Also share this story to someone who might be interested. Let's get into the story. The vibrant city of Oladale was bustling with life, a reflection of the ambitions and dreams of its inhabitants. For Becky Ejiofor, life seemed to be on a steady rise. Her position as a senior marketing executive at Interglobe Consult, one of the city's most reputable firms, was a result of years of hard work and relentless sacrifice. Her achievements were often the subject of admiration and respect within her professional and social circles. However, admiration had a way of turning sour in those harboring hidden resentment, and for Becky's stepsister, Lillian, it was a slow-burning bitterness masked by a friendly smile. Becky and Lillian's lives had been intertwined since their teenage years when Becky's father remarried after her mother's death. At first, their relationship seemed promising, two young girls forced into sisterhood by circumstance. Becky had genuinely tried to welcome Lillian into her world, offering warmth and sharing her dreams, but Lillian never saw her as a sister. Deep down, Lillian always felt overshadowed, and their stepmother's constant praise for Becky only deepened her resentment. It wasn't that Becky did anything to belittle her. It was simply that Becky excelled at everything, while Lillian struggled to find her place. At Interglobe Consult, Lillian worked under Becky's supervision. To outsiders, they appeared to be a close and supportive duo, but behind closed doors, tension simmered beneath the surface. Lillian couldn't stand living in Becky's shadow. Every time Becky received an award or commendation, Lillian's jealousy grew sharper, like a thorn lodged deep in her heart. She masked her envy well, always presenting herself as the caring, supportive younger sister. Yet, in the privacy of her thoughts, she plotted ways to bring Becky down. The cracks in Becky's seemingly perfect life didn't end at work. At home, her marriage to Jacob was beginning to show signs of strain. Jacob was a charming and ambitious man whom Becky had met during her early career days. Their courtship had been whirlwind, full of passion and dreams for the future. But as the years passed, those dreams became burdens. Jacob's own professional struggles weighed on him, and although Becky tried to be supportive, he sometimes resented her success. He wouldn't say it aloud, but Becky sensed his discontent in the way he would withdraw, spending more time on his phone or out with friends than engaging in their marriage. Becky often sought solace in Lillian, venting about her frustrations at work and home. Lillian listened attentively, nodding and offering advice that seemed comforting on the surface, but subtly planted doubts. "Maybe you should slow down a bit at work," Lillian would suggest with a sweet smile. "You've been pushing yourself so hard. Jacob probably just wants more of your time." Becky would sigh, running a hand through her curly hair. "I know, but I can't afford to relax now. There's a major project coming up, and if I don't oversee it, everything could fall apart." Lillian's eyes would narrow slightly, though she kept her expression sympathetic. "I understand. Just remember, you don't have to carry everything on your shoulders. It's okay to let others handle things sometimes." Becky appreciated the advice, never suspecting that Lillian's words were part of a calculated plan to undermine her. While Becky continued to juggle her responsibilities, Lillian worked behind the scenes, befriending key colleagues and subtly spreading seeds of doubt about Becky's leadership abilities. Small comments like "Becky's been really stressed lately," or "maybe she's taking on too much," began to circulate in hushed conversations around the office. At home, things worsened. Jacob grew more distant, and Becky couldn't understand why. He no longer initiated conversations or showed interest in her work. Whenever she brought up the topic, he would dismiss her concerns with vague reassurances. "I'm just tired, Becky," he'd say with a weary look. "Work's been overwhelming." She tried to believe him, convincing herself that it was just a rough patch. But the nights grew colder, and the emotional gap between them widened. Becky often lay awake, staring at the ceiling and wondering where things had gone wrong. Was she truly neglecting her husband, as Lillian had hinted, or was there something deeper she wasn't seeing? Meanwhile, Lillian continued to ingratiate herself with both Becky's colleagues and Jacob. She played the perfect sister-in-law, always offering to help Jacob with errands or join him for casual outings under the guise of family bonding. Jacob, already feeling neglected, found Lillian's attention comforting. What began as harmless interactions gradually turned into secret rendezvous, both of them feeding off their shared frustrations with Becky. Yet Becky remained oblivious to the storm brewing around her. She focused on her upcoming project at work, unaware that Lillian was quietly sabotaging her efforts. Deadlines were mysteriously missed, and key documents went missing. Each setback chipped away at Becky's confidence, leaving her vulnerable to both professional and personal collapse. The shadows of jealousy and betrayal loomed ever closer, but Becky, caught in the whirlwind of her responsibilities, had yet to see how deeply they had taken root in her life. For now, she trusted the two people she should have feared the most. But the cracks were growing wider, and soon everything she had built would come crashing down. Oladale's skyline gleamed in the early morning sun as Becky pulled into the parking lot of Interglobe Consult. The previous night's restless sleep clung to her like a fog, but she shook it off and entered the building with her usual smile. She had a reputation to uphold. The marketing department was buzzing with activity, and Becky was determined to focus on the major campaign ahead, a high-profile project that could open doors to bigger opportunities for the firm. However, things were not going as smoothly as they had before. Over the past few weeks, small but irritating problems had begun to creep into her work. Miscommunications with suppliers, missing emails, and delayed meetings became an unexpected pattern. Becky, meticulous by nature, double-checked her procedures but couldn't find the cause of these issues. As Becky sat at her desk reviewing reports, Lillian walked in carrying 2 cups of coffee. She wore a bright, reassuring smile as though sensing Becky's stress. "Good morning, sis," Lillian chirped, placing one of the cups in front of Becky. "You looked like you could use this." Becky smiled gratefully. "Thanks, Lil. You have no idea how much I need this." Lillian took a seat across from her, feigning casual concern. "Rough day already," Becky sighed. "It's this campaign. Everything that can go wrong is going wrong. The clients are getting restless, and I'm starting to feel like I'm losing control of the project." Lillian leaned forward slightly, her expression sympathetic. "I'm sure it's just a rough patch. You've always handled bigger challenges than this. Maybe you just need to delegate more. Let your team take some of the pressure off." Becky hesitated. She prided herself on her hands-on approach and had always believed that a good leader stayed close to the details. But Lillian's words carried a gentle wisdom that was hard to dismiss. "Maybe," Becky murmured. "I guess I've been overthinking everything lately." "That's understandable," Lillian said smoothly. "You're under a lot of pressure. Just don't be too hard on yourself." They chatted a bit more before Lillian excused herself, leaving Becky to her thoughts. Becky didn't know that in Lillian's wake, subtle damage was being done. Under the guise of assisting the team, Lillian had been quietly undermining Becky's authority. She had developed close relationships with a few junior staff members, feeding them misinformation and sadly encouraging them to question Becky's leadership decisions. "You know Becky's been under a lot of stress," Lillian would say in hushed tones during coffee breaks. "Maybe that's why things are falling through the cracks. I mean, it's not like her to miss deadlines." These comments, delivered with an air of sisterly concern, began to plant doubt in the minds of their colleagues. Lillian made sure to never say anything overtly critical. Instead, she let others draw their own conclusions. The cracks in Becky's reputation widened quietly, almost imperceptibly. Meanwhile, Becky faced growing frustrations from her clients. During a crucial meeting with one of them, a promised set of promotional materials failed to arrive on time. The client, an executive from a tech firm called Bytesphere, was visibly annoyed. "I thought you said this would be ready by today," the client, Mr. Kalu, said with a frown. Becky's heart sank. "It was supposed to be delivered first thing this morning. Let me check with my team and get this resolved immediately." After the meeting, Becky stormed into the marketing department, her frustration barely contained. "Where are the materials for Bytesphere?" she demanded. Her assistant, Vivian, looked flustered. "I sent them to the courier yesterday, Becky. I don't understand what happened. Find out now, Becky ordered. She rubbed her temples, feeling a headache coming on. Everything was slipping out of her control, and she couldn't figure out why. Lillian appeared moments later, her face a picture of concern. Hey, I heard about the Bitesphere issue. What happened? Another delay, Becky said bitterly. I can't catch a break. Maybe it's time to take a step back, Lillian suggested softly. I know you're trying to handle everything, but sometimes things spiral when we're too close to them. Maybe let Vivian and the others handle the details while you focus on strategy. Becky nodded reluctantly. You might be right. The truth was Becky had no reason to suspect Lillian. Her stepsister had perfected the art of deceit, always stepping in at just the right moment to offer comfort and advice. She never gave Becky a reason to question her loyalty. As the days passed, Lillian continued to pull strings behind the scenes. She intercepted important emails, redirected critical communications, and manipulated schedules to create conflicts that Becky couldn't anticipate. The project deadlines began to pile up, and the pressure mounted on Becky from both clients and her superiors. At home, things weren't much better. Jacob seemed even more distant, often giving vague excuses for staying out late or being preoccupied. Becky tried to reach out to him, but he brushed her off with half-hearted reassurances. Work's just been hectic, he said one evening, barely looking up from his phone. Don't worry about me. But Becky did worry. She felt isolated, trapped between the mounting chaos at work and the growing silence in her marriage. Yet through it all, she clung to the belief that things would eventually improve. She had no idea that the people she trusted most were the ones orchestrating her downfall. For now, Lillian's mask of support remained firmly in place, her true intentions hidden beneath a veil of perfect sisterly concern. The storm was far from over, and Becky was still standing in its eye, unaware of the betrayal looming just beyond the horizon. The offices of Interglobe Consult, located in the heart of Oladale, were filled with a tense atmosphere as Becky pushed open the glass doors that morning. She had arrived early, determined to regain control of the spiraling situation surrounding her project. Despite the setbacks, she still held hope that with enough effort, she could turn things around. She didn't know that her enemies were already steps ahead of her. It wasn't long before her boss, Mr. Iredale, summoned her to his office. Becky's stomach tightened as she walked down the long corridor, trying to reassure herself that it was just a routine check-in. However, the heavy look on Ayodele's face as she entered his office told her otherwise. Becky, sit down, he said, gesturing to the chair in front of his desk. His voice was unusually formal, a departure from his usual friendly demeanor. Becky obeyed, her palms beginning to sweat. Is something wrong, sir? Ayodele sighed and leaned forward. Becky, I'll get straight to the point. The board has been monitoring the recent issues with the Bitesphere campaign and other projects under your supervision. Unfortunately, the clients have lost confidence and it's causing serious damage to the company's reputation. Becky's eyes widened. Sir, I can explain. There have been delays, yes, but I've been working non-stop to resolve them. I understand you've been trying, Ayodele interrupted, his tone softening slightly. But we can't afford any more failures. The board has decided that it's in the company's best interest to let you go. The words hit Becky like a physical blow. She stared at him in disbelief, her mind racing. How had it come to this? She had always delivered results. Was all her hard work truly being dismissed because of a few recent problems? Sir, please, give me another chance, she pleaded. This project means everything to me. I can fix this, I just need more time. Ayodele shook his head. I'm sorry, Becky. The decision is final. The meeting ended in a blur, and Becky walked out of the office in a daze. Her colleagues whispered behind her as she made her way to her desk. It was clear that rumors of her dismissal had already spread. Her hands trembled as she began packing up her belongings. She had devoted years of her life to this job, and now it was gone in an instant. Before she could fully process her emotions, Lillian appeared, feigning shock and concern. Becky, I just heard what happened. They're firing me, Becky whispered, her voice barely audible. They think I'm responsible for the project failures. Lillian gasped dramatically, placing a comforting hand on Becky's shoulder. Oh no, that's terrible. There's no way this is your fault. You've always been one of the best managers here. Becky shook her head, fighting back tears. I don't even know where to begin. Everything's been falling apart and I can't figure out why. I've done everything I could. Lillian leaned in closer, her voice soft and reassuring. Listen, sis, I'm going to help you. We'll figure out who's behind this. There has to be someone sabotaging you. I won't rest until we get to the bottom of it. Becky felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. Thank you, Lillian. I don't know what I'd do without you. You'll be fine, Lillian said with a warm smile. You're strong. Just take some time to rest and focus on yourself for now. Becky didn't suspect a thing. To her, Lillian was the only person who truly had her back during this difficult time. Little did she know that Lillian had orchestrated the entire downfall, carefully weaving lies and manipulating circumstances to ensure Becky's failure. At home, the situation with Jacob deteriorated further. He didn't even acknowledge Becky's loss of her job when she finally worked up the courage to tell him. They fired you, Jacob said, barely glancing up from the television. Yes, Becky replied softly, hoping for a sign of empathy or support. Maybe you weren't managing things as well as you thought, he said bluntly, his tone void of sympathy. You've been distracted a lot lately. Becky blinked, hurt by his cold response. I was working hard, Jacob. You know how important that job was to me. Jacob shrugged, his eyes fixed on the screen. Jobs come and go. You'll find something else. Becky stared at him, feeling a growing emptiness inside. The man who had once been her partner and greatest cheerleader now treated her as though she were a burden. His indifference cut deeper than the loss of her job. Days turned into weeks, and Becky struggled to regain her footing. Lillian continued to play the role of supportive sister, calling regularly to check on her and even dropping by with meals and words of encouragement. I'm still looking into things at the office, Lillian would say, her voice full of false sincerity. Don't worry, I'll find out who sabotaged you. Becky clung to the hope that Lillian would uncover the truth. She had no idea that her stepsister was laughing her back, reveling in her victory. Lillian had not only taken Becky's career, but was also growing closer to Jacob, filling the emotional void he claimed Becky had left. Blinded by trust, Becky remained unaware that her greatest betrayal was still unfolding in the shadows. The people she loved most were the architects of her downfall, and her world was unraveling faster than she could comprehend. The quiet streets of Ravenswood, a residential area in Oladale, were serene that morning, but Becky's mind was anything but calm. Days of unemployment had stretched into weeks, and each one weighed heavier on her. She had spent hours sending out job applications, but rejection after rejection chipped away at her self-esteem. What stung the most wasn't just the loss of her job, it was the growing emotional distance between her and Jacob. Becky sighed deeply as she sat on the couch in their living room, staring at the blank television screen. Jacob had left early, claiming he had a meeting with a potential investor. His vague explanations and frequent absences had become the norm. She didn't have the energy to argue anymore. When the doorbell rang, Becky stood and opened it to find Lillian standing there with a warm smile and a bag of takeout in hand. I thought you might need a pick-me-up, Lillian said cheerfully, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. I brought your favorite jollof rice and grilled fish. Becky managed a weak smile. Thanks, Lil. You didn't have to go through all this trouble. Oh, please, you're my sister, Lillian replied, placing the food on the dining table. I know things have been tough lately. You deserve a break. They sat together at the table, eating in companionable silence for a few moments. Becky felt a wave of gratitude. Despite everything, at least she had Lillian. She was the one person who had consistently been there for her during this difficult time. How are you holding up? Lillian finally asked, her tone filled with concern. Becky shrugged, setting down her fork. I'm trying. Some days are better than others. I just feel lost. Everything I worked for is gone, and Jacob doesn't even seem to care. He's so distant, Lillian. It's like he's already given up on us. Lillian reached across the table and squeezed Becky's hand gently. You've been through so much, Becky. Maybe it's time to ask yourself if this marriage is really worth saving. I mean, you've been carrying the weight of it for so long. At some point, you have to put yourself first. Becky swallowed hard, tears stinging her eyes. The thought of divorce had crossed her mind more than once recently, but hearing Lillian say it aloud made it feel more real and more terrifying. I don't know, Becky whispered. We've been together for so many years. I don't want to just walk away. I get that, Lillian said softly, her gaze steady. But think about how much you've sacrificed. You've always been the one trying to make things work, and what has Jacob done in return? He's barely here for you. You deserve someone who appreciates you, Becky. You deserve happiness. Lillian's words echoed in Becky's mind long after the conversation ended. They sounded so reasonable, so caring. It was easy to believe that Lillian truly wanted the best for her. But unbeknownst to Becky, Lillian had a far more sinister motive. She wanted Becky to divorce Jacob not out of sisterly concern, but to clear the path for her own ambitions. Over the following days, Lillian remained a constant presence. Whenever Becky needed to vent, Lillian was there, ready to listen. She brought Becky small gifts, sent encouraging texts, and reminded her to take care of herself. Slowly, Becky began to rely on her stepsister in a way she never had before. Lillian's comforting presence became a crutch for Becky's wounded spirit. One evening, as they sat on the balcony of Becky's home, sipping on glasses of chilled juice, Becky opened up more than she ever had. Do you ever think about how things would have been if we hadn't become sisters? Becky asked quietly, staring out at the city lights. Lillian tilted her head thoughtfully. Sometimes. But I think we were meant to be in each other's lives. I mean, who else would understand you like I do? Becky smiled faintly. You're right. You've been my rock through all of this. I don't know what I'd do without you. Lillian's smile widened, though it didn't reach her eyes. You'll always have me, Becky. No matter what. The next morning, Becky tried to discuss her feelings with Jacob again, hoping to salvage what little remained of their relationship. He sat across from her at the breakfast table, scrolling through his phone with a detached expression. Jacob, she began hesitantly. Can we talk? He didn't look up. What about? About us, Becky said softly. I feel like we've been drifting apart. I want to know if we can fix things. Jacob sighed, finally setting his phone down. Look, Becky, I'm tired of having this conversation. Nothing's going to change. Maybe you should stop worrying so much and focus on yourself for a while. The coldness in his voice cut deep, and Becky felt her hope crumble. Is that really how you feel? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what you want me to say, he replied with a shrug. I'm just being honest. Becky nodded slowly, her heart breaking all over again. She excused herself from the table and went to her room, where she collapsed onto the bed in tears. Lillian called later that day, her timing impeccable as always. Becky poured out her frustrations, and Lillian once again suggested that maybe it was time to move on from Jacob. You deserve peace, Becky, Lillian said gently. Don't stay in a situation that's draining you. Becky didn't know how much longer she could endure the pain. As Lillian's web of deceit tightened around her, Becky remained blind to the true threat lurking within her own family. Lillian's mask of kindness stayed firmly in place, and Becky's trust in her only deepened. But the storm was far from over, and betrayal was about to strike again in ways Becky couldn't imagine. The late afternoon sun cast a golden hue over the quiet neighborhood of Oak Ridge Heights, but Becky's heart felt cold and heavy. She sat on the front porch of her home, absent-mindedly staring at the street as children played nearby. The emotional weight of the past months bore down on her, making every breath feel labored. Despite Lillian's continuous support, an unsettling feeling began to creep into Becky's mind. It was a quiet whisper she couldn't fully understand. Something wasn't right. Jacob's behavior had grown increasingly erratic. He was more absent than ever, often leaving for hours without explanation. He no longer tried to hide his disinterest in their marriage, and Becky wondered if he had already checked out emotionally. He didn't seem to care how obvious his detachment was anymore. Hey sis, Lillian's voice broke Becky's thoughts. She was standing at the gate, waving with her usual bright smile. Becky stood up slowly and opened the gate, letting her stepsister in. You're early, Becky remarked as Lillian walked past her. Well, I figured you could use some company, Lillian said, her voice cheerful. You've been in your head too much lately. I thought we could have a girls' night, watch some movies, drink a little wine, and just relax." Becky smiled weakly. "That sounds nice." Lillian's presence, as comforting as it seemed, didn't completely dispel the sense of unease that had begun to grow in Becky. Small inconsistencies had started to pile up in her mind, things she hadn't noticed before but now couldn't ignore. For one, Lillian seemed to know more about Jacob's whereabouts than Becky did. Whenever Becky brought up his late-night absences, Lillian would downplay it or change the subject, always steering the conversation back to Becky's well-being. Later that evening, as they sat on the couch watching a romantic drama, Becky turned to Lillian with a question that had been nagging at her. "Do you think Jacob is seeing someone else?" Lillian's eyes widened slightly before she quickly composed herself. "What? No. Why would you think that?" "I don't know," Becky replied, frowning. "He's been so distant. He doesn't talk to me anymore, and he's always out. I can't help but wonder if there's someone else." "Becky, listen to me," Lillian said, her tone firm but soothing. "Jacob is probably just dealing with his own issues. You've both been through a lot lately. Don't jump to conclusions. Sometimes men act distant when they're stressed." Becky nodded, though her doubts remained. Lillian's response sounded rehearsed, almost too perfect. Still, Becky had no reason to suspect her. Lillian had been her lifeline through all this. Why would she lie? The cracks in the deception widened further a few days later. Becky had driven to the market in Cedar Grove to pick up groceries. As she walked through the aisles, she spotted someone familiar. Jacob. He was standing near the produce section, casually laughing with a woman Becky didn't recognize. The two of them seemed too comfortable, too familiar with each other. Becky froze, watching from a distance. Her mind raced, struggling to process the scene. She considered confronting him, but stopped herself. Instead, she quickly turned away and hurried out of the store. Her heart pounded as she drove home, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. Once she reached home, she paced the living room, replaying the moment over and over in her mind. Was this the confirmation she had been dreading? She didn't have the answers, but the sight of Jacob laughing with another woman haunted her. That evening, she tried to talk to him when he returned, but his responses were short and dismissive. "Who were you with at the market today?" Becky finally asked, crossing her arms as she stood in the doorway of their bedroom. Jacob barely looked at her as he unbuttoned his shirt. "Market? I wasn't at any market." "Don't lie to me, Jacob." "I saw you there," she insisted, her voice trembling with frustration. He sighed heavily, finally turning to face her. "You're imagining things, Becky. Maybe you saw someone who looked like me." "Don't insult my intelligence," Becky snapped. "I know what I saw." "Believe what you want," Jacob muttered, brushing past her. "I'm too tired for this." Becky stood frozen, anger and confusion swirling inside her. His gaslighting only deepened her suspicion. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was being hidden from her. As the days passed, other small clues began to surface. Jacob became increasingly careless, forgetting to hide text messages or leaving his phone unlocked. One night, Becky accidentally glimpsed a message from Lillian on his phone. It was short but strange. "Don't forget. Same place tomorrow." Becky's brow furrowed. Why was Lillian messaging Jacob about meeting in secret? It could have been harmless, but given everything else, it made her stomach churn. Slowly, pieces of a puzzle she hadn't even known existed began to fall into place. She didn't want to believe it, but the possibility that both Jacob and Lillian were betraying her gnawed at her. The cracks in Lillian's carefully constructed mask of support were beginning to show, and Becky's instincts whispered that the truth was much darker than she had imagined. It was only a matter of time before the full picture revealed itself, and when it did, Becky knew there would be no going back. Becky felt the chill of the evening air creep into her bones as she sat on her bed, her thoughts racing in all directions. The suspicion gnawing at her had become unbearable. Every small clue, every strange encounter, and every whisper of doubt had piled up, forming an unbearable mountain of uncertainty. Her instincts told her that something was wrong, deeply wrong, but she had no clear proof. Yet, sleep was out of the question that night. Becky found herself scrolling through the messages and call logs on her phone, not really knowing what she was looking for. She knew Jacob had been hiding something, and Lillian, well, that part confused her. The message she had seen from Lillian on Jacob's phone kept replaying in her mind. Why was her sister secretly arranging meetings with her husband? Unable to sit still, she rose to her feet and paced the room. Her mind wandered back to the countless times Lillian had been there for her, comforting her, advising her, and helping her navigate her struggles with Jacob. How could someone who had been so supportive possibly have a hidden agenda? Becky shook her head, trying to push away the thought, but it kept clawing its way back. A sudden urge to confirm her fears overwhelmed her. She grabbed her coat and purse and left the house, her mind set on finding answers. She drove aimlessly for a while, unsure of where to go, until a name crossed her mind: Miriam, one of Lillian's old friends who worked in the events industry. Miriam and Lillian had once been close, but something had caused a rift between them. Becky figured Miriam might know something. The drive to Miriam's apartment in Cedar Ridge felt like an eternity. Becky rehearsed what she would say, but decided to be straightforward. When Miriam opened the door and saw Becky, her surprise was evident. "Becky? Wow, it's been a while. What brings you here?" Miriam asked, stepping aside to let her in. Becky hesitated for a moment before answering. I need to ask you something about Lillian." Miriam raised an eyebrow but motioned for Becky to sit. "Lillian? That's unexpected. What's going on?" Becky didn't waste time. "I need to know if Lillian has been seeing Jacob behind my back." Miriam's face froze for a moment before she sighed and looked away. "I was hoping you wouldn't find out like this," she murmured. Becky's heart sank. "So it's true?" Miriam nodded reluctantly. "I don't know all the details, but I heard things through mutual acquaintances. Lillian's been involved with Jacob for a while now. I didn't say anything because I didn't want to meddle in your family matters." Becky's vision blurred as tears welled in her eyes. The betrayal hit her like a punch to the gut. Lillian, the person she had trusted the most, was having an affair with her husband. The room felt like it was spinning as she struggled to process the revelation. "I trusted her," Becky whispered, her voice shaking. "She was supposed to be my sister." Miriam placed a comforting hand on Becky's shoulder. "I'm so sorry, Becky. I know this must be devastating." Becky nodded wordlessly, trying to keep herself together. After a few moments of silence, she stood up. "Thank you for telling me the truth," she said quietly. She left Miriam's apartment and drove aimlessly for hours, her mind spiraling through a storm of emotions. Anger, sadness, humiliation, and confusion all fought for dominance. When she finally arrived home, the house was dark and eerily silent. Jacob wasn't there, and for once she was grateful. The next morning, Becky was too numb to leave her bed. She lay there for hours, replaying every interaction she had ever had with Lillian and Jacob, searching for the moments she might have missed, the moments when their betrayal began. She was still processing this when another bombshell hit her later that day. While scrolling through her email inbox, Becky stumbled upon an anonymous message that made her blood run cold. It contained records of internal office memos and reports, evidence that someone had deliberately sabotaged her projects at Interglobe Consult. Attached to the email was a name: Lillian. Becky stared at the screen in disbelief, her hands trembling. Lillian had been behind everything: her career downfall, the project failures, the delays, all of it. The same sister who had comforted her through her darkest days had orchestrated her dismissal while pretending to help. A sob broke free from Becky's throat as the weight of betrayal crushed her. She felt as though her world was crumbling around her. The two people she had trusted most had conspired to destroy her life. Lillian hadn't just stolen her husband. She had stolen her career, her dignity, and her peace of mind. Overwhelmed by grief and fury, Becky screamed into the silence of her empty home. Hot tears streamed down her face as she sank to the floor. She had been blindsided in the most cruel and calculated way imaginable. For hours, Becky lay there in a daze, unable to move. Slowly, though, a spark of something new began to ignite deep within her, a fierce, unrelenting need for justice. She wouldn't let them get away with this. Not Lillian, not Jacob. They had betrayed her in ways she never thought possible, but they had also underestimated her. Becky knew she had to take control of the situation, And when she did, the consequences would be severe. Becky sat in her dimly lit living room, the soft ticking of the clock the only sound breaking the silence. The night stretched on endlessly as she grappled with the weight of her discoveries. Her mind, once fogged by confusion and misplaced trust, now burned with a clarity that sharpened her pain into something else: rage. A deep, consuming rage. She had spent too long doubting herself, second-guessing every decision, and blaming herself for things that were never her fault. Lillian and Jacob had played her perfectly, weaving lies so intricately that she hadn't seen the betrayal until it was too late. But the truth was out now, and with that truth came a realization. She wasn't going to be their victim any longer. The following morning, Becky woke up early, her mind clearer than it had been in weeks. She wasn't going to confront Lillian or Jacob just yet. That would be too easy. No, she needed to be strategic. They had spent months, maybe even years, plotting against her, and now it was her turn to plan. Becky grabbed a notebook and began to write down everything she knew. She listed the evidence of Lillian's sabotage at work and the clues that hinted at her affair with Jacob. She thought about the anonymous email she had received and the documents attached. There had to be someone inside Interglobe Consult who knew what Lillian had done. If she could find that person, she could gather more evidence to ruin Lillian's career for good. Later that day, Becky paid a visit to Elijah, a former colleague at Interglobe. Elijah had always been loyal to her, one of the few people she knew she could trust. He had been transferred to a different department shortly before her dismissal, which meant he might have been spared from Lillian's manipulations. "Elijah, I need your help," Becky said as they sat in a quiet corner of a coffee shop. Elijah frowned, leaning forward. "Of course, Becky. What's going on?" She hesitated for a moment before revealing the truth. "I've recently learned that Lillian was the one who sabotaged my projects. I have some evidence, but I need more. You were still at the company when things started going wrong. Do you remember anything suspicious?" Elijah's eyes widened in shock. "Lillian? I knew she wasn't exactly a saint, but I didn't think she'd go that far." "She did," Becky confirmed grimly. "She pretended to support me while tearing me down behind the scenes." Elijah shook his head in disbelief. "I do remember there were whispers about you losing control of the campaign. Some of the junior staff members would complain about missed deadlines and poor communication. But I always found that odd because you were never the type to let things slip like that." "Exactly," Becky said. "I need to track down anyone who can confirm that Lillian spread those rumors or interfered with the project timelines." "I think I know a few people who might talk," Elijah said thoughtfully. "Give me a couple of days to reach out to them. We'll get to the bottom of this." Becky nodded, feeling a small glimmer of hope. "Thank you, Elijah. I can't tell you how much this means to me." As she left the coffee shop, Becky felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about her career anymore. It was about reclaiming her dignity and holding Lillian accountable for everything she had done. At home, however, another storm awaited her. Jacob returned that evening, and his carelessness was on full display. He walked in without greeting her, tossing his jacket onto the couch and heading straight to the fridge. Becky watched him silently from the dining room, her anger simmering beneath the surface. She had spent years building a life with this man, only for him to betray her in the most unimaginable way. "Long day?" she asked, her voice calm but laced with tension. Jacob glanced at her briefly, as if surprised she was still there. "Yeah, busy," he muttered, grabbing a bottle of water. "Busy with Lillian?" Becky asked, her eyes narrowing. Jacob froze for a fraction of a second before recovering. "What are you talking about?" Becky stood, folding her arms across her chest. "Don't play dumb, Jacob. I know about the two of you. I know everything." His expression darkened, but he tried to maintain his composure. "You're imagining things again, Becky. You're always overthinking." "Stop it," Becky snapped, her voice rising. "I'm not overthinking anything. I saw the messages. I saw you with another woman at the market. And now I know Lillian has been scheming against me this whole time, both at work and my marriage." Jacob's silence was all the confirmation she needed. He didn't even try to deny it anymore. Instead, he scoffed and shook his head. "Fine. You want the truth? Yes, I'm seeing Lillian. but maybe if you had been a better wife. Don't you dare, Becky interrupted, her voice shaking with fury. Don't you dare put this on me. You betrayed me. Both of you did, and you'll both regret it. Jacob stared at her, clearly taken aback by the fire in her eyes. Becky had always been composed, the type to avoid confrontation, but that version of her no longer existed. This conversation is over, Becky said coldly. You'll get what's coming to you soon enough. As Jacob stormed out of the house, Becky stood her ground. She had been broken before, but now she was stronger than either Jacob or Lillian could have anticipated. The pieces of her plan were slowly falling into place, and when the time was right, she would strike back with a force they would never see coming. The evening sky over Oak Ridge Heights was a deep shade of violet as Becky stood by her window, looking out into the quiet street. A storm of emotions brewed inside her: grief, betrayal, anger, but above all, resolve. She had spent the past few days gathering everything she needed to bring Lillian and Jacob's world crashing down, just as they had done to hers. Her patience had run out, and now it was time to act. Earlier that day, Elijah had called to inform her that he had spoken with several of their former colleagues. They confirmed that Lillian had manipulated the department from within, spreading lies about Becky's competence and sabotaging key projects by interfering with deadlines and client communications. One of the junior staff members had even admitted to being coerced by Lillian into providing false reports to the management team. Elijah promised to send the statements and supporting documents to Becky. With this ammunition in hand, Becky planned her next move. Lillian's career had flourished in the months since Becky's dismissal. Lillian had become the department head at Interglobe Consult, using Becky's downfall as a stepping stone. It was time to strip her of that success in a way that would leave a lasting stain on her reputation. Becky's first stop was the office of Mr. Iredale, her former boss. He was seated behind his large mahogany desk when she walked in, unannounced, but with a commanding presence that silenced any objections from his assistant. Becky, Iredale looked up in surprise. What brings you here? I need you to see this, Becky said, placing a folder of documents on his desk. It's the evidence you should have had before I was fired. Iredale hesitated for a moment before opening the folder. As he read through the contents, his expression shifted from confusion to shock and then to anger. Lillian was behind all of this, he murmured. The delays, the rumors, she orchestrated it all. Exactly, Becky replied, her voice steady. And while she was destroying my career, she was pretending to be my greatest supporter. I came here today because I want you to understand the full truth. I don't expect my job back, I've moved on, but I do expect you to take appropriate action. Iredale leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his graying hair. This is serious. If the board finds out about this, Lillian's position is as good as gone. Good, Becky said coolly. You can decide how to handle it, but just know that I won't stay silent if you choose to protect her. Iredale nodded grimly. You have my word. I'll handle it. As Becky Loffice, a sense of empowerment surged through her, but she wasn't done yet. There was still the matter of Jacob and Lillian's personal betrayal. It was time to confront them both. That evening she sent a message to Lillian asking her to come over. Lillian arrived, as expected, with her usual air of false concern. Becky, I was surprised to get your message. Are you okay? Lillian asked, stepping inside with a worried expression. Sit down, Becky said curtly, her voice devoid of warmth. Lillian blinked in surprise but complied. Becky stood in front of her, arms crossed, her gaze piercing. I know everything, Lillian. The sabotage at work, the affair with Jacob, all of it. Lillian's face went pale, and for the first time she was visibly rattled. Becky, I don't know what you're talking about. Don't insult me by lying, Becky interrupted sharply. I trusted you. I told you my fears, my struggles, and you used them against me. You destroyed my career, my marriage, and you thought you could get away with it. But your time is up. Lillian opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She seemed to realize that there was no point in denying the truth anymore. I never meant for it to go this far, she finally whispered. I was jealous, okay? You had everything: success, a husband, a life that people admired. I was tired of being second to you. Becky shook her head in disbelief. You could have had your own success without tearing me down, but instead you chose to betray the only person who ever saw you as a sister. At that moment, the front door opened and Jacob walked in, freezing when he saw the two women facing each other. What's going on here? He asked, his eyes darting nervously between them. Becky turned to him, her expression cold. You're just in time. Lillian and I were discussing your betrayal. Care to add anything? Jacob tried to laugh it off. Becky, don't be dramatic, don't, Becky snapped. I'm done with the lies. Both of you used me and discarded me like I was nothing. But I'm not nothing. And now both of you are going to face the consequences. The room fell into a tense silence. Lillian and Jacob looked at each other, their shared guilt palpable. Becky let the moment linger before speaking again. I want you both out of my life, she said firmly. I've already set things in motion at Interglobe. Lillian, your career is over. And Jacob, I'm filing for divorce. You won't get a single cent from me. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to say. Becky stood tall, unbroken, and stronger than ever. The people who had sought to destroy her were now watching their worlds collapse. Becky turned on her heel and walked away, leaving them to deal with the wreckage they had created. For the first time in a long while, Becky felt free. We've come to the end of this story. Please subscribe to my channel to support me. Thank you.